Ed Gein was a notorious murderer and body snatcher who inspired the creation of several fictional horror characters, such as Norman Bates in Psycho and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. He exhumed corpses from local graveyards and fashioned trophies and keepsakes from their bones and skin. Magdalena Solis, known as the High Priestess of Blood, led a cult in the 1960s that committed ritualistic murders in the small village of Yerba Buena. She manipulated her followers through religious fanaticism and claimed to be a reincarnation of an ancient Aztec goddess. Edmund Kolanowski was a necrophilic serial killer who operated in Poland during the 1970s, targeting women in cemeteries and mortuaries. He was known for dismembering his victims and engaging in necrophilic acts with their corpses. Anatoly Onoprienko, dubbed the Terminator, was a Ukrainian serial killer responsible for the murders of 52 people, including entire families, between 1989 and 1996. He claimed that voices commanded him to kill, and was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment. Raman Raghav, also known as Psycho Raman, was a serial killer active in Mumbai during the 1960s, targeting homeless individuals and slum dwellers. His brutal crimes, committed with a blunt object, led to widespread fear and panic in the city. Yang Xinhai, nicknamed the Monster Killer, confessed to murdering 67 people between 1999 and 2003 in a series of home invasions across China. He was executed in 2004 after being found guilty of multiple counts of murder, rape, and robbery. Tsutomu Miyazaki, also known as the Otaku Murderer, abducted and murdered 4 young girls in Japan between 1988 and 1989. He was infamous for his grotesque acts of necrophilia and cannibalism, as well as his collection of disturbing videotapes. Thomas Neil Cream, known as the Lambeth Poisoner, was a Scottish-Canadian doctor who murdered several women in London during the late 19th century using strychnine. He was eventually caught, tried, and executed in 1892 for his crimes. Joachim Kroll, dubbed the Ruhr Cannibal, was a German serial killer and cannibal who confessed to murdering 14 people, including children, from 1955 to 1976. He was arrested after police discovered human remains clogging his apartment's plumbing system. Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Rostov Ripper, was a Soviet serial killer who committed at least 52 murders of women and children between 1978 and 1990. He was executed in 1994 after being convicted of his heinous crimes, which involved mutilation and cannibalism. Bevan Spencer von Einem is an Australian convicted murderer and suspected serial killer involved in the notorious family murders of young men in Adelaide during the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Richard Kelvin in 1984. Gracious David West was a Nigerian serial killer who confessed to the murders of at least 15 women in various hotels across Nigeria in 2019. He targeted vulnerable women, strangling them before stealing their belongings. Ramadan Mansour, known as Al-Turbini, was an Egyptian serial killer and gang leader responsible for the abduction, rape, and murder of street children during the early 2000s. He was executed in 2010 after being convicted of his horrific crimes. Catherine Monvoisin, also known as La Voisin, was a French fortune teller and poisoner involved in the notorious affair of the poisons during the reign of Louis XIV. She was executed in 1680 after being found guilty of witchcraft, poisoning, and infanticide. Leonardo Cianciulli, known as the soap maker of Correggio, murdered 3 women in Italy between 1939 and 1940 and used their bodies to make soap and tea cakes. She believed that human sacrifices would protect her son, who was fighting in World War II. Boonpeng Heeplek, a notorious monk-turned-serial killer in early 20th century Thailand, was executed for the murders of several women and the subsequent dismemberment of their bodies. His crimes were motivated by greed and superstition. Cedric Macke, known as the Hammer Killer, terrorized Johannesburg in the late 1990s, murdering at least 27 people using various weapons, including rocks and hammers. He was sentenced to 1,340 years in prison for his heinous crimes. Luisa de Jesus, also known as the Foundling Wheel Killer, was an 18th century Portuguese serial killer who murdered at least 33 abandoned infants left at the Foundling Wheel in Coimbra. She was executed in 1772, making her Portugal's last woman to be executed by hanging. Juan Severino Mayari was a Filipino parish priest who murdered 57 people in the early 19th century to use their blood for black magic rituals aimed at curing his mother's illness. He was eventually arrested and executed for his crimes in 1840. Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega, dubbed the Old Lady Killer, murdered at least 16 elderly women in Santander, Spain, during the late 1980s. He was known for sexually assaulting and strangling his victims before robbing them. Siswanto, known as the Human Butcher, was an Indonesian serial killer who murdered at least 12 women between 1994 and 1996, dismembering their bodies and disposing of them in various locations. He was executed by firing squad in 1997 for his brutal crimes.